Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval southern Italy and the Italian islands between the 11th and the 15th centuries, mostly focusing on government and administration during the various regimes that followed one another in these regions. We have not made so many videos about southern Italy as a whole. I usually tend to distinguish in sort of a more medieval sense southern Italy from Sicily, etc. But we will, for the sake of simplicity, talk about southern Italy as a whole, as we were talking about the contemporary country. There is no specific reason. It's a bit like Scandinavia. These are, by some sources, parts of Europe treated in an oddly marginal way, right? For different reasons that basically mostly get down to the uniqueness of their characteristics, and therefore something that doesn't fit sort of the more general approach to just like a more normally sort of post-Carolingian European vision. This is the reason why I follow some of this very trend from the cycle, but I want to talk more about southern Italy. As a matter of fact, I'm even preparing some, and not even just southern Italy technically, because there were some areas, for example, the Kingdom of Sicily, that were also part of central Italy. There are the Abruzzes, for example. They're very interesting. They're historically overloaded. But I also get the impression that it's better somehow to have started. I have naturally lots of videos about southern Italy already, but not as much as sort of the aforementioned more central regions of Europe. But it's good that we approach these areas in some sort of more advanced stage of Schwerpunkt. First of all, because we have a lot of background about lots of things, including the same region. Recently I made, for example, a series about southern Italian Sicilian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century, which sort of from the military point of view more or less overlaps with today's video's chronology. But also because we can explain this from sort of more effective standpoint and drawing parallelisms with other areas. There are many reasons why also the history of the Italian Mezzogiorno is so relevant. In many ways, this is a big system, right? This is not like a fringe area that literally was so because it was sort of less developed than others. In a sense, at least in the way, comparatively to the way it's represented, right? There are other areas of Europe that are, say, more represented because eventually there was a national bulk from that you can reconduct partly to the contemporary reality and or some broader narrative. But southern Italy especially is actually one of the most fertile, also populated and well-connected areas of Europe. It can't quite be simply skipped. Of course, if you start comparing this, especially from this video timeline beginning with central and northern Italy, you can argue that southern Italy was in many ways sort of less cohesive and somehow already spent in terms of sort of political protagonism and capacity, especially before the Norman conquest, compared in fact to the territories that had belonged that still belong, in fact, to the Longobards, the Italic kingdom at that point. I also realized that there is a lot of confusion every time you talk about Italian history. It turns out, if you make a simple Reddit search, the weirdest kind of questions made just for this country and basically nobody else. It's as if Italy was the sum of some alleged issues that nobody can resolve. Also in historiographical explanation, every other country, from rich to poor, from sort of post-socialist to Western, is sort of easy to frame. Everything is fine. Let them going as they want. With Italy, everybody seems to have an opinion. Nobody really seeming to give an actual answer about anything, nor acknowledging sort of the most also objective fundamentals, socioeconomically, politically, etc. Right? For most people, even say here we talk about southern Italy, but obviously there is going to be a comparison with the broader peninsula. Italian history stops to essentially Rome in the Renaissance, right? The idea properly that there is a magnitudinal output of medieval, modern, even contemporary power and cultural legacy is somehow absent, right? Inexplicably so, especially when we know this country's history like very well. Like this is not an area of Europe like, I don't know, like the ones belonging to the Ottoman Empire, or that, you know, still haven't developed a fully fledged academic culture. Like Italy is at the top, like, of excellence in, you know, historical humanistic studies, but you somehow never hear of this, never kind of acknowledge even the important rigor behind this, meaning that, you know, while in the United States everybody seemingly complains that the humanities are overloaded in Marxism, the Italians actually do, together with the French, together with the Germans, but possibly even better, their homework, right? Yeah, they have a hell of a university culture, and so there are many reasons why these stories are somehow not making it to the further world, let's say. In part, and we've seen this for military history, it's the Italians' faults themselves, meaning that indeed after fascism, after World War II, this is valid for continental Europe at large, the history of warfare was essentially equated up to the 80s, the 90s, to nationalism, when not to fascism proper, and so it was not really, you know, in the wake of mostly the cultural Marxistic prevalence that also existed, or at some level, in these universities, to the higher level. Let's say, while, you know, the Anglo-American world was like pumping out things even at a non-academic level, like war game series, etc. It really were like the fruit of an impressive research. The Italians did not contribute excessively. This is true also for other, again, parts of Europe. Like this is true for other countries that somehow still haven't made it into the popularization of their own history in general. From the other side, there is a linguistic limit as well. I mean, not everyone knows Italian, but this is also increased as an issue because Italy has actually a lot of sources, right? Not just in Latin, that, you know, we have PhDs, not even in Germany know how to translate Latin anymore, but also in Italian vernacular, since, of course, in the Middle Ages, that objectively require a very highly sophisticated expertise to even sort of, not even just to know how to translate that, which is, you know, relatively easy like any other Western language, but that required this immense progressed education and culture, considering the radical output of civilization that these areas provided. So that you had, for example, in the Anglo-American, think about Mallet. We recently talked about the condottieri, right? These were guys that had sort of some, you know, satisfactory academic culture, but that simply browse in the broader unexplored landscape, still up to the 1970s and 1980s, of, in that case, essentially late medieval Italian warfare, and just write, I don't know, a 200 pages long book that could tell you more or less what the picture was, right? I often complain now against the war games, like, you know, Jan Heath, kind of, he passed away just a couple of years ago, so, you know, so I don't want to talk ill of, you know, a person that also worked really well, but for that matter, you understand it was a separation. It was sort of a categorically different approach to, say, I don't know, of course, mostly British, but sometimes even, this is a problem also that gets towards, a bit like towards Western Europe as well. Like, I don't know whether it's some sort of colonial legacy, like of sometimes focusing more on maybe Oriental contexts as before properly Western European ones, but that did also wait. And I am on YouTube aside from as a creator, but, you know, from quite a while, and I honestly have never seen like a channel that actually deals with Italian history in a satisfactory way. Even less so with southern Italy, right? The most popularized image of southern Italy comes from, Godfather movies, etc. There are masterpieces, the first two. But let's not digress on this topic. The general acknowledgement of the actual history behind this, but not just in the sense of how many foreign dominations, like this sort of, spent piece of land really suffered of it, as opposed to, what kind of actual power or organization or centrality and, strategic weight and international capacity the system have. That's completely skipped. And that you could add on top of that all kind of other sort of stereotyping that derives from, again, like in part the Black Legion, the Reformation, the sense that, I don't know, the time of Southern Europe was over at a certain point, and that in spite of the fact that these remain actually up to, especially Southern Italy, if you want to single out like the actually more backward system compared to the center and the north, they always remain like pretty rich throughout all the entire history. Like up to the 18th century, actually, in beyond up to the 19th, like century up to the Napoleonic era, was actually pretty rich and well placed, right, in the international order. Like anecdotally, it's not just about, I don't know, Naples being the largest city in Europe, or having this, in fact, European connections, being just at the head of a large kingdom, etc. But it's really about counting. Like if you have studied the politics of the time, the warfare of the time, and the actual quantity there that, doesn't seem to be acknowledged or represented for some reason whatsoever, as if everything magically shifted towards Northern Europe and the rest of the continent didn't have any relevance whatsoever. This is even more pronounced during the Middle Ages. I remember once there was a guy who was, those kids obsessed with the Normans. I met different of them. There were some anecdotes about them that are funny. This person knew everything about the Normans, and literally, of course, we're talking about, 10 years ago, a level of severe underschooling and whatever among, Facebook users that bragged about the Normans, but had somehow never conceptualized the notion that there was a major Siculo-Norman kingdom that was veritably the single most centralized in the entire Latin Germanic Europe, that was even more powerful than the Kingdom of England, and that, is one of the single most influential realms also for European culture, with the Sicilian school of poetry and later by Frederick II during the Swabian period, with all that derived from that. All right. It is true, however, that this system, as we were pointing out before, was very different and not necessarily for the better. Already at this point of medieval times, some of you asked me at some point, because there are the questions that tour the internet sometimes, when did Southern Italy begin to lag behind the rest of the peninsula? This is not a video in which I will discuss that, but you sticking to the 11th century with which we begin, we have first of all to picture out the fundamentals. Like this system, first of all, was not unified. Essentially, since the Longobard invasions, it wasn't a single unitary administration until the Norman conquest. So we're basically talking half of a millennium of no comprehensive domination capable of stretching across this entire region, right? And pretty straightforwardly, we're talking actually about a non-obvious unitarily, controllable place. I mean, there is southern Italy that has also like a heavily mountainous interland, and so it's difficult, especially to reach from across. Like, yes, it's at the end of a peninsula, so and quite a quite trafficked sea. But even these areas hardly connect with one another. Yes, there is mostly a Byzantine control, but then you have the Saracens as well, that act a bit like the Vikings with these fortified entrenchments where they deposit their loot, and differently even from the Vikings, not carrying out a great deal of ethnic, influence on the surroundings, simply because North Africa was overwhelmingly less populated than the northern shores of the Mediterranean. And then you have Sicily, that, however, is the most central island in the Mediterranean, so the one that controls some of the most, still today, like some of the most important strategic choke points that NATO very validly presides with massive naval and aerial bases, and that, since antiquity, as you know, is overwhelmingly fertile, right? And even more so, actually, in terms of agricultural exploitation in the Middle Ages, right? In the Middle Ages, you have an incredible mechanism that we've seen very often in other videos, whereby Sicily begins to export grain for literally the entire Mediterranean. I mean, you're between it to the ancient world when you have Tunisia and Sardinia together with Sicily that fundamentally supply the Italian peninsula for feeding the Roman mob. Equally, Egypt with Constantinople, later the Ukrainian grain for the same. In the Middle Ages, starting from the Norman era, you have Sicily exporting grain to Egypt. I don't know if you picture, like, I made multiple videos explaining like the Italian trade and financial dominance throughout the sort of the second half of the Middle Ages and beyond. But this is insane. Like what you see, as I was saying before, also in the early modern age, is that this enormous, especially agricultural output of southern Italy continues to provide for the economy, for pre-industrial economy, a very consistent amount of wealth that, we tend also not to think too much about. If you, again, think about the great powers of 18th century Europe, do you even hear the Kingdom of Sicily, right? It was a biased realm, that's true, so it wasn't so politically independent, but it was autonomous enough, and also a pretty big system on its own. Now, without digressing further on other eras, but at some point it's important to make you picture where did this come from, right? What did happen also in the Middle Ages? We're trying part to explain, right? And then you have Sardinia, which I realize from quite a while that we haven't made a single video on specifically. We talked about it in videos about Byzantine Italy. We addressed, of course, different Pisan history during the communal era, of course. But we probably have to make a pretty hefty series to compensate for the absence of, right? That is a bit of a system on its own, admittedly, often escaping the same Sicilian power that at large tends to towards it. In the Swabian era, the Kingdom of Sardinia, the one that eventually, as Sardinia Piedmont, that would eventually, from Piedmont, however, not Sardinia, unify the Italian peninsula itself, was established for Heinz, the son of Frederick II, in the mid 13th century. The guy who was captured by the Bolognese and died imprisoned in a tower in the city, and that had historically, however, had a quite autonomous form of administration dating essentially to Roman times, so-called Judicates, that are one of the single most fascinating juridical and administrative, institutional, I would say even, stories of the entire early and high Middle Ages, especially, because as we'll see later now, some other, say, more impositive regimes really come, even though the coastlines had always sort of been exposed. You have the Vandals, the Byzantines, the Saracens. Again, it's a very complicated history, right? And overall, this territory, what does Apulia have to do with Sardinia? Like, very few, admittedly, but they would sort of share still some characteristics, mostly connected with this exposure towards more compact systems, that even when establishing, in fact, a monarchy within southern any of these lands, have a relatively hard time to control, like for the entirety of the Middle Ages, the ensemble, right? And for different reasons that we will see now, and that for the rest are also notorious. Now, we will also deal with the ethno-linguistic issues later, because this is also the narrative. People want to make often this effect, oh, look, there were Greeks in southern Italy. Oh my god, this even connects with, the ancient colony. nothing to do with that, right? First of all, the Greek presence in southern Italy is incredibly scarce, right? We're talking about few 0.0, I don't know, something percent. Like, for example, the Albanian community dating from the refugees escaping from the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans in the 15th century is like much more importantly and historically relevant aspect like of the southern Italian ethno-linguistic landscape that is overwhelmingly Italic, right? You don't even speak like there are. How often do you hear about, I don't know, the Catalans of northwestern Sardinia, or the Ladins, or the Germans, those maybe about South Tyrol, the Occitanians in Piedmont? No, it has to be these damned Greeks, because there is this pan-Mediterraneistic racialistic obsession by which, for some reason, the Italians and the Greeks should have something to do with one another, which they actually don't. Right, they have literally like very different histories. The Hellenic presence was a thing, of course, in antiquity, but as we know, with all Greek colonization, very much constrained to a very few, tens of miles inland, were overwhelmingly Italic. Most of the relics of Greek spoken today in some, again, very small islets of southern Italy are of medieval origin. Right, they have a few to do with the ancient. Not to say that Greek was not an important language spoken still by, say, the arrival of the Normans and beyond. I made some videos explaining this for the administration of Sicily and southern Italy exactly during the first generation of the conquest. But, we tend to forget not just the Italic, but also Roman Christian substratum. It also survived, for example, during Islamic Sicily, right? And one of the reasons why you don't hear of that much is, first of all, that, yes, there aren't so many sources to begin with, because the interland was somehow isolated, which is a very interesting characteristic of this, what you would expect to be sort of the most open, right, peninsular part, like probably to the maritime dimension, the Mezzogiorno, right? But mostly because culturalism, this obsession actually for multiculturalism in the last decades had only to stress the multi-ethnic approach to everything, as if this was such, for everything, the Roman Empire, certain aspects of the medieval world, as if there weren't like overwhelming disproportions in the actual presence of different groups. And southern Italy was some sort of, just inextricably mixed system. Indeed, the genetic history of southern Italy is very complex, but not really complicated. Central northern Italy are sort of more ethnically cohesive throughout the eras. But even for the south, if we stick to a sort of mostly ethno-linguistic side of the story, again, there is a prevalent, a dominant continental Italic background to that. Right, and so also the notion, again, like these were peoples like, I don't know, the Saracens, for example, had a great ethnic impact. No, right, even the fact that southern Italians are on average darker than the northerners actually doesn't have much to do with that period in history. It's just a sort of progressed story, and we do not have much evidence of that enormous, especially North African influence at all. And again, let's stress that these were very sort of consistently populated, and especially at the beginning of the Middle Ages, very advanced places. So, right, you couldn't simply, again, cause ethnic, displacements to a great degree. This is always the case. The same Saracens at large, for example, in Sicily, it's a different story, but even there, they maintain mostly maritime sort of interest. And in southern Italy, they're mostly called as mercenaries by the same southern Italians. It's not like, I don't know, northern Europe where you have the Norse that actually have a large genetic impact on the local populations, because the populations were pretty scarce to begin with, so that had a greater impact, right? So this is really, really important, just as a basic frame to understand what was going on. And we don't have to make a larger premise for all the political situations of the various chunks, right, of southern Italy before the Norman conquest that more or less manages to fundamentally bring everything under more or less a single rule by feudal standards. So you can argue that the 11th century was this moment of greater particularism, where you had pre-existing communities like, the Longobards, the Byzantines, the Saracens. You have some greater papal or sort of Frankish influence, and even more. But this is, not really stopped per se, but it's brought now under a single, more unitary direction in the political and territorial organization that the Normans will make of this place. This is crucial in as much as the Normans brought a completely different and especially feudal culture in southern Italy that had essentially remained largely, given that it had remained on the outskirts of the post-Carolingian Italic kingdom, to which technically could have been, in large parts, especially of southern Interland, become part through the legacy of the Langobardia Minor, right? So the chunk, in fact, of the Lombard kingdom that was not really included in the same Lombard kingdom that is the Italic one within the Holy Roman Empire after Charlemagne's conquest, and that therefore mostly rely on the Byzantine world, fundamentally, in part also how the Arabs had done this, mutuating it from the Romans and the Sasanians, of essentially a statally and bureaucratically organized system. Now, when I say this, it doesn't actually mean that these places had a great deal of statal bureaucratic organization at all, right? But this had historically not allowed, this general regime, in spite of the decentralization of especially the city-states of the various Byzantine duchies of the Tyrrhenian coast of southern Italy, Amalfi, Gaeta, Naples, Salerno, you named them. That enormous, land estates, let's say, that characterized by this time the Western Frankish feudalism at large, right? And that basically all the post-Carolingian kingdoms had been affected by. This may seem paradoxical because, as you know, late antiquity had relied on large estates, right? But in southern Italy, as in the rest of the peninsula, this had collapsed much before, yet there had never been, in fact, a further, wave of conquest that could simply reorganize, take over everything and concentrate power in the hands of single people, like the Normans would do. And even in this case, it's an exception within exception, because the Normans, yes, do import a feudal vassalatic beneficiary system that is very effective in gluing together, paradoxically, through an originally decentralized system, actually towards a statal one that, especially in the Norman case, will be the peak, like England, but especially Sicily, will be incredibly power-concentrated kingdoms for, again, Latin Germanic standards. But because the monarchs that control these territories realize that they can counter the traditional problem they had in France, of these incredibly powerful vassals that would disobey to the crown, by sort of making leverage on the diversity of this territory, right? If I have massive Orthodox Byzantine monasteries, for example, that still have an important relevance, especially in a city context, these areas are very intensely urbanized. For example, the Byzantine world is not as urbanized as southern Italy. This is for so many videos we already made, about the much greater, actually, Latin Germanic advancement during even the early Middle Ages. That, of course, in this case mirrors a degree of political fragmentation, autonomization, etc. But you have cities, you have the countryside, you have now the barons, you have different ethnicities. You have the Longobards that literally have their own Longobard laws from the time of Rotary with the local southern Lombard additions. You have the Greeks and their cities. You have actually still like this broader problem now. The Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantines. We've seen how the Normans come about in these places and what kind of stance they take. Like they are essentially vassals of Saint Peter. They have a very, very, very close connection with the papacy that, in fact, Sicily will maintain throughout all its history until the Italian unification. And so you have this even papal enclaves, like Benevent, for example, decides to, at the moment of Norman conquest, to give themselves to the papacy, a bit like Avignon, like these enclaves of papal territory into other people's lands. So you have so many different pawns, including, for example, the Muslims of Sicily that have remained, even though most of them have really go back to Tunisia at some point during the conquest. But those were all elements that some unhappy historians began to say, this is an example of tolerance. No, it's not an example of tolerance, at least not in the sense that we intend tolerance today. Actually, this would be proper for what tolerance really means, which means to bear something displeasant. But the capacity of tolerating these also enemies of the faith, for which, for example, the Siculo-Normans were considered by the other crusaders in this age, albeit being very, very powerful. Think about the Hauteville, the Principality of Antioch, and Bohemond of Taranto, etc. Poulain, right, some sort of bastards, because they had sort of lived even amongst these. It's not even just about the Muslims, but even the Greeks, right? You know, the Latins did not really have much, greater feelings between, like, I don't know, the Muslims, the Greeks, even the just Christianized Baltics. They were all barbarians who could simply exterminate them. It was much of a problem. Naturally, in order to rule a kingdom, however, that's something different, and the Hauteville dynasty is quite enlightened, right? They run their kingdom pretty well, especially as it's fully established by the beginning of the 12th century. All right, and the shocking change here for the locals is so not everything changes, but in the countryside there had been local Italian lords, right, that had tried to essentially to exploit this perennial situation of decentralization, where you could have, I don't know, sometimes the Byzantines arrive, sometimes the Franks arrive, sometimes the Saracens arrive, but at the end of the day, nobody really ruled in this place, because it was really in between, like at the fringe of all these bigger systems, and they all contributed to destabilize the region at the detriment of the opponent. These lords have formed, but basically taken over by these much larger Norman seigneuries that really are provincial in scale, and so not simply local, and that redistribute this power in a very private fashion, like it's typical again from Frankish culture, and so creating this baronial estate that will actually be a problem on the long run for the kingdom. Not at the moment, because again, more or less every European country was ruled in similar ways. And actually, as we were saying, the Kingdom of Sicily will become the single most juridically and institutionally advanced in Western Europe. But it, on the long run, it's from these barons that the essential powerlessness of the monarchy will stem from, right? This is I made recently also some videos about the Aragonese government of Naples, etc. Basically, you have this external kings or vice kings locally that are very much connected to some sort of thalassocratic power. They come from, again, a part of the southern system that it does not really consider every place as their home, because it's so big and different within. And basically the barons run the hinterland, right? Even though it's incorrect really to see it like that, but if you think about mafia in the sense of compromise, the sense of corruption, in the idea of there is a ruler, but it's inefficient, and these guys behind the scenes maintain control of the system, it's a bit like that, because the entire feudalism is essentially a mafioso concept, right? It works in the same exact way. Like mafia pre-exists the state, and so just when the state is powerful enough, the system decides to to eliminate these elements that sort of roll backwards or that are somehow parasitic. And so you have what we call the modern state and sort of more advanced systems. Well, this is what will make the Kingdom of Sicily ultimately fail in the age of reforms in the 18th century, so that in the 19th you witness that debacle that will allow, in fact, the Italians to take over the system that was really a house of cards. These were Italians as well. Like, that's the other great contention, that Italy did not exist. It wasn't a common Italian language. This is absolutely false, right? If you look at, especially compared to other major European countries that have actually much sort of truly like different ethnicities within. Look at Great Britain, or the same, what we consider as France, like with Occitania, with even German parts and beyond. Like, actually, Italy had not just a very homogeneous culture and language, but also from a very early era, because it was a highly literate and a highly interconnected country. And so it's not like, I don't know, taking the usual example of unitary times, like, I don't know, what like a Piedmontese or a Sicilian peasant speak, and just confronting them is actually, an emblem of the highly, developed Italian culture throughout all these centuries that, of course, understood too well one another to the point, in fact, of deciding to unite, and also in ex post in a clamorously successful way, because a country that, differently from the other major Western European ones, did not have hundreds of years of political unity in its past history, well, managed to resist things like 2 World War IIs, 20 years of fascism, united, and also essentially becoming one of the most important economies, and also pillars of NATO, etc. In after the Second World War. So we're looking at actually an incredibly dynamic and also successful history that has such deep roots, right? Other countries sort of took much longer time to even coalesce in the local institutions. Italy had such clamorously developed institutions for such a long time, but also for this reason, like, took more time to create something that could, in fact, satisfy the tastes of the locals, that, as long as they had their city-state or kingdom or whatever within the peninsula, were fine with that, right? That's how, I don't know, they lost the Italian wars, at least part of their own independence like that, and also paid for that kind of, again, deficit of hundreds of years of political unity, differently from other countries. But what are we talking about? Germany basically unified even 10 years after Italy. You have other countries that sort of came to be, as it were, even cancelled from the map at the point, thinking about Poland. So I think that in this sense, Italian history deserves much greater attention and respect than what is commonly attributed to it as always this anomaly. It's not because you don't understand it, you haven't studied its history. Let's be honest, you haven't. Like, then the problem is Italy per se. No, there is some other issue behind it. As you understand, the Norman conquest brought to a process of broader feudalization. For example, an increasing number of castles were constructed independently by various Norman milites, becoming new centers of power. We'll see all these steps today. We'll go in very sort of basic ABC sort of step, but that this Norman conquest was at large well directed, well organized. There was an important degree of autonomy at the same time from these groups coming from various areas. It wasn't just Normandy, but other parts of France, even of Germany, of Lombardy. For example, there are some Gallo-Italic dialects in the very heartland of Sicily, and these were Lombard colonists who were settled, in fact, in Norman times, that still are, in fact, for example, much more important than the Greek minority, incomparably so, by the way. And how many times have you even heard of this? Like, just those channels that want to amaze you with the strange facts about the languages in Europe. Oh, look at how strange. There are these guys that are speaking like, yeah, because if you had a basic first world education, you should actually know that, right? But unfortunately, even if on paper you did, you actually never had. And so that's unfortunately a price that we have to collectively pay. Encastellation served to form, in fact, a much more comprehensively, unitary form of control on these lands. It, however, remained largely decentralized from the Hauteville power that was centered in Palermo, Sicily. One of the reasons that was the case is that Sicily was much easier to control in a unitary fashion because it had a more straightforwardly unitary history. It was pretty big, pretty fertile, and so you had a Byzantine and then Saracen background, whereas southern Italy, again, is much more complicated. You have so much difficulties in the interlands. You have the Byzantine duchies, you have the Longobard ones, you have the other Norman baronies that often rebel, especially in the fertile Apulian plateau. So it's complicated to simply establish a single unitary power at the beginning. Initially, when the Norman conquest is just, ad personam provincial titles, then again, only in the early 12th century, Roger II, you have properly the papacy also bestowing this title, King of Sicily, so encompassing basically everything from Sicily to central Italy on the Adriatic coast that was under, in fact, the Sicilian crown. Now, the Norman aristocracy, particularly associated with the Hauteville dynasty, introduced feudal systems into these territories, creating counties that often altered and at times mirrored the territorial divisions previously established by the Byzantine themes and Longobard principalities. This could have not been otherwise, but the idea was trying to homogenize the system on a comital basis. You know that all post-Carolingian kingdoms are subdivided in counties, right, in comitatus, right? We talk about that, for example, the Italian communes in the north were just the product of, in fact, also in that case, like a comitatus installed on the previous Roman district, single city. The problem with southern Italy is that it had been run largely without that, again, unitary administration in the centuries before. Also, there wasn't really like a single unitary basin. Like in the north, you have the Longobard kingdom fundamentally framed within the Po Valley, enclosed by the Alps. Then you have the Arno civilization in Tuscany. The south does not have really anything like this. And so it was much more difficult to homogenize the system, especially when you had literally like different polities that all had sort of their own way of running the area. Actually, there was a framework of Roman and also Hellenic urbanization from antiquity that survives, right? And that is mirrored, for example, in the disproportional amount of dioceses that exist in southern Italy, and that the papacy keeps pumping resources into in that aforementioned way to control, like in this sort of almost toxic relation with the Sicilian kings. Like there were some areas of Europe in which the ecclesiastical provinces were just, I don't know, a bunch, like in Germany. Like in southern Italy alone, you had tens of them. And so that tells you also how, regardless, this will be always true, like throughout the entire Middle Ages, of the incredibly prolific southern Italian output, but the complete mess, in its regulation. Unfortunately, because of the fact that the Normans also choked any sort of political autonomy of the various cities, that became, on the long run, essentially big coastal markets for the, selling, exporting the agricultural products from the baronial lands in the hinterland. Even though you have, again, huge cities like Naples, Palermo, etc., for the times being, you do not really have the type of civic political historiography of the central northern Italian world. You don't really. There are communes, actually. The southern, all Europe, as we've seen, has communes in the way we intend them. Southern Italy does as well, but we know so few about them. even in times of great prosperity of the system, like during the Swabians or the Angevins. We'll also seen, we will come back on this now, how Byzantine southern Italy was the most urbanized part of the empire. We've seen in the series about Byzantine warfare, at the beginning of the period before the Norman conquest, how the Byzantine, the southern Italian militia of the Byzantine Empire were essentially the most organized and capable militias of the entire empire, right? In terms of literal, city levies and their organization. We've seen this also in other videos, for example, the one at the Battle of the Aragon, where you have them used, for example, by the same Normans against the Byzantines just a few decades after the conquest. So there is really a lot to cover, and I promise we will do this very thoroughly, very well for this region as well. In much of the Norman kingdom, the aforementioned counties formed the primary organizational structure, right? Largely shaped by the area's challenging geography and the characteristics of its predominantly agrarian economy. As far as this is concerned, there are really no differences from any other, say, at this point, we can say Frankish country. The main post-Carolingian areas really resembled one another, where again, what would become essentially France, Germany, and Italy. Then at this point, you have the Normans pushing this further with England and Sicily. You have also Frankish culture permeating countries like Spain, for example, and beyond. So again, this area is pretty much all normally run in the same way. You have these important cities with a great coastal potential that, as we'll see now, we've seen it especially in the videos about, say, Pisa especially, but also Amalfi, etc., that tended to be at the mercy of the Italian maritime republics, meaning that compared also to other Mediterranean powers, the Sicilian kings didn't really have any other choice but allowing these maritime republics into their harbors, like giving them some local quarters, and so essentially installing themselves there with their troops as well. There were clashes at some point between the Pisans, the Genoese. This very intertwined. Again, we don't have this, with, say, imperial policy, the relations between Sicily, the papacy, the Byzantines. It's a mess, right? But as you understand, this system has not really enhanced much this maritime potential, right? If anything, there's the bit like the Byzantines, like the Siculo-Normans do have a fleet on their own. They can put it together. They do have local craftsmen, say, in the coastal cities, and they are pretty advanced. Again, the northern deal, but they don't have that political autonomy that allows these guys to more freely associate, to create some sort of republics. And if anything, the kingdom remains much more dependent on the northern Italian maritime republics. This is even more accentuated when, for example, the Hohenstaufen succeed to the Hauteville, to Sicily, and so historically, Ghibelline Pisa would be rewarded in that process as well. The Holy Roman Emperors had always tried to conquer southern Italy, as you know, for the full capacity of Italian control, and so from there Constantinople, and so the reunification of the entire Christendom and the Roman Empire in Europe and the Mediterranean. So this comital framework persisted under the subsequent Swabian and Angevin rules. There's nothing strange about that, because the same Germans and French were habituated to rule through the same administrative system. Notably, geographical and settlement patterns are important to consider in this world, because they express a bit like the psychology also of the inhabitants. As highlighted in different studies in many parts of southern Italy, human settlements often appear to be segregated from their landscapes rather than organically connected to them, right? This is an incredibly important observation because you see, there is a bit this cliche that in the age of, say, the Saracen invasions, again, everybody was terrorized and lived into places that they were ready to abandon just to retire uphill in fortified places, await for the raiders to take the loot away, and then hopefully coming back, among the ruins and rebuilding. If this is not really true in a broader sense, meaning that again the Saracens will never fully be able to take over like the major cities. It happens sometimes. This happens with Bari, with Taranto, but they are temporary eveniences. Not just these are reconquered by the Byzantines and the Franks, but in fact these continue to rule in these places, and very often they're the same ones who use the same Saracens for their purposes. However, it is true that the southern Italian populations were more enrocked, were sort of more closed paradoxically, than basically like it's difficult to draw parallelisms. I don't know whether this is the case for Greece or Spain, whatever, but the sense is that there is really together with the loss of that political protagonism, with the lack of local states capable of fundamentally acting on their own, also in an offensive way, the local populations began to entrench themselves literally into these fortified hilltops of previous acropolises, or like wherever they were well installed. And sometimes in coastal positions were very difficult to take. Think about Amalfi, for example, that will resist the same overwhelming Norman power for a long time, because literally the only passage to the city is an incredibly impervious pass in the mountains, just overlooking the sea. Genoa is similar in a conceptual sense, but was also more permeable and yet more powerful at the same time. So you see, it's difficult to draw dichotomies and make other cliches. The sense, though, is that the southern Italian populations were sort of much more enclosed on their own, right? They had essentially given up, like trying to create anything on their own, aside from this local centers. They were very well organized, as we've seen in the case of the Byzantine militias, that were actually these local Italian ones from the previous settlement in antiquity, just continuing their existence. At some point, there had been a florid, even, Jewish trade. This is especially true as long as antiquity continued. But say, these were advanced eras. I mean, the patriciates of Naples, Amalfi, Gaeta, were actually pretty rich, powerful people. They had fleets at their disposal. They knew how to defend their interests. They are the guys who start making a lot of money quickly, in that basically profit in the last era of like the Islamic golden age that basically stretched with its commercial influence up to these very places, minting taris, like just to profit of the general, again, the centralization of the Islamic economical system. It wasn't also that strongly permeating. The strongest Islamic powers were basically in Spain, right? The Tunisians, the one that created the Emirate of Sicily, weren't actually that powerful. Like also, Islamic Sicily at a wall was sung as this incredibly, oh my god, it's so exotic, it was so beautiful, the Arabs were so advanced. Really, aside from the fact they weren't really Arabs, but there is no evidence actually that Islamic Sicily was that greatly advanced. Look, we know there was a lot of commerce, a lot of trade. Palermo was a big city, but again, also in that case, you don't find a great deal of strong political territorial control organization. And actually, you don't have practically almost anything architecturally or monumentally speaking from Islamic Sicily. There's just, I think of the Ziz outside Palermo that was also reused in later time, but literally, like, where is this Islamic civilization in Sicily? Like, zero. Like, all the rest is, again, you find Roman, Greek, Byzantine, Norman, and later, of course, Swabian, Anjou. It's plenty of that. Where's the Muslim stuff? Actually, there isn't. Right? It's not like they were destroyed, whatever. We know, again, that there was a lot of, we've seen it from also the military culture of the region, a lot of imitation of Islamic styles and motives. Mostly when we think of that, we're looking, in fact, at certain craftsmen that were, like, they may have been Muslim, but in, say, those Norman or Swabian times, were rather imitating overseas, like, Saracen motives from some very advanced courts of Islam, but not really having, in that sense, more directly in common to do with. and it's complex, right? We find the same goes for the Byzantines. The Madrid Skilitzes, for example, is beautiful, most beautiful manuscript Byzantine history in its illumination. It was actually done in Sicily, right? It's all written, it's in Greek, etc. But it's you can't see there is something more humanistically developed in that, from that Italian background, that what normally the Byzantines did, like in Constantinople at Similia. So what actually sort of surfaces in this is a particularly sort of original local blend that is not just the sum of all what sort of this external influences, but some character that, in spite of this lack of political activism before, let's say, the Norman conquest, actually had a spirit on its own. After all, these were historically, again, very advanced areas, and just they had suffered during the early Middle Ages for this lack of political unity that had heavily disintegrated public authority. That is only now coming back with the kingdom and in a unitary way. And first of all, I would like also to stress that this is a new, sort of a different era. Like even before I said, like, this overall area of southern Italy and Sicily, etc., was not unitary controlled since the Longobards era. Yes, in a sense, but just think about how, I don't know, the same Sicily had been controlled at some point by the Vandals, then by the Goths. I mean, there had been sort of backs and forths that had gradually... I made a video about Byzantine Sicily, by the way, that explained an entire series telling the truth about medieval Sicily. That's actually the only part of southern Italy that we covered in the regional series at a, in a very consequential and complete fashion. But again, had there really ever been a southern Italy intended? Is that really not, right? Also, Italy historically, like the continental part, was always separated from Sicily during the Roman Empire, for example. Like, so, there are some characteristics, like the Hellenic colonization, but also, like, there is half a millennium of Roman control, which is something different. And aside from this, also Italic background that is proper also the rest of the peninsula, up to the north, like, there isn't really much specific about that. In antiquity, if anything, central and southern Italy were more similar historically, right? Rome and Campania, for example, were very tied up to pretty late in time historically, up to the 13th century. But these are things we must necessarily take a look. If I only think about all the southern Italian region that they could have covered, like, for the historical regional series, we have like hundreds of videos to make actually on. So this local population, including the aristocracy, adopted already, because miracles could not be made after this, several hundred years of subjection. You say, when did started southern Italy decline compared to the north? Since the Roman times, like since before, right? I mean, the Roman conquest of the Magna Graecia was, per se, just the manifestation of an intrinsically superior system. Compared, like, Rome, compared mostly to the Oscan hinterland and the Hellenic city-state, like, that's when it begins, right? It's the south is historically richer, etc., but shouldn't be also excessive about this. Like, already by the early Middle Ages, you basically have the system balancing out, and by the 11th century, we realized that the north has been taking off and the south was really something else. So you have this local population really adopting this mere adaptation attitude to the general local constraints. Because even when these Normans arrive, like, they initially feel like they're foreign lords of some sort. And even if the kingdom does compact, in spite of the various rebellions of these various chunks, led also by, of course, like the locals, headed by the local Norman barons against the Haute-Ville, these are not easily reconnectable territories, right? They're, again, just connectable by sea, but they're also largely fruitful because there is an hinterland that is fruitful. This is not like, in fact, Byzantine Europe, where you have just basically the most important centers on the coasts. Southern Italy has a lot of that, but there is also an hinterland of urbanized, like regrowing, like together with the entire, again, Frankish, Romano-Frankish system, like re-expanding properly from the hinterland, right? That's why also you can't stress even any sort of Greek centrality in this at any point in local history, because the countryside was much more powerfully national than, say, what you had, I don't know, in the Balkans or in Anatolia. It was something else, really. And the hinterland was specifically Lombard in more recent terms, especially in southern Italian mainland, and even local, I mean, Sicilians spoke Latin, Romance, at least at this point. So it's, again, all this hyper bombardment about external elements when you, however, have a very specific local ethnos may be misleading regarding what was going on. In fact, it's not like this population was really poor. Actually, it was pretty rich compared to European standards. Just their political control was less intense than other parts, like, I don't know, the communes, for example, in the north. And at large, they are more similar to, I don't know, an average French or German or English population that is under a feudal regime of some sort, right? So there isn't even there any specificity. But it's also not an autochthonous power that they're serving. So this doesn't create many issues, because we live in a traditional reality where if the local lord is capable, like if everybody is kind of participative, like if these places had hated the Normans, they would have put up a terrible revolt. Like, look what happened in England after the Norman conquest with the herring of the north. The conquest of southern Italy is pretty smooth, telling the truth. Again, you can have local barons that rebel, say the Apulian ones against the king in Sicily, but there are, yes, the Lombard communities, they're very entrenched in the mountains, but they're cities, like they're not savages, so there is a gradual general recognition of everybody's prerogatives. There is a broader settlement that gives a lot to the local barons, because of also, as we'll see now, the general instability of the dynastic control of the land that further, in fact, erodes in that otherwise, like especially in Norman Swabian times, a pretty solidly public institutional juridical culture. But there are, again, wars, invasions, minorities, you know what we're talking about, because we covered them in different times. So you just stay there and see what happens. This is, in a way, this is a bit also like the southern Italian spirit, stereotypically. I hope no follower gets offended, but at least that's the main criticism. As you know, also in the general issue of the Italian unification, basically all the southern Italian whining about the fact that we're conquered, whatever, it's just a pile of BS. Like, you know, it was even if that was an actual conquest, it was an incredibly positive thing. If anything, if there were issues, were both like locally caused and just following the conquest rather than in the conquest itself. Actually, that the Italian unification would have not happened if the southern Italians hadn't largely satisfactorily stood for it, right? And so this is exactly what happened here, because you don't have these communities really caring very much about proactive transformation of the beyond like the constraints put by the, I don't know, the geographical or the economical limitations. They were fine with living out, and again, it's not so strange. Like, again, we have this more contemporary issues with southern Italy that is like at the level of a post-socialist country, with a central northern Italy that has even, you know, more per capita wealth than France or Germany, but it's really like normal by medieval times to have a population that largely behaves like this, especially towards a lord, regardless, in sort of the feudal establishment, regardless of the foreign nature of the same. I mean, the Normans themselves were foreign to England, but England was faring fine. Nobody today thinks, oh my God, the Anglo-Saxons were such lambs because they were conquered by the Normans. Like, again, they fought a lot against that, but they even lost. So at least southern Italy had at large, actually even more florid history later on in comparison. Remember these things, because you will never find this level of political and historical analysis. I've never met a single YouTube channel that makes this kind of comparison. I actually never heard a single historian making this kind of comparison, so you may want to take note if you're really interested in the history of the era, because I'm giving it to you as straightforwardly as I can, as always. Now, in order to establish the organizational frameworks of the kingdom, a relatively intricate system of officials, especially like in the later Norman and the Swabian era, was created, right, to oversee the counties and manage the military. This was the case of the constables, or judicial and financial responsibilities, the justiciaries and chamberlains, respectively, alongside a higher hierarchy of feudal jurisdictions that were taking on an ever more provincial nature over the counties. For example, you have the Duchy of Apulia, the Principality of Capua. There would be others, like historically the Principality of Taranto, the Duchy of Calabria. As we'll see now, this will evolve also in southern Italy from an administrative point of view in a pretty effective way, right? And so you have here an important level of centralization you don't really find in other systems. I mean, England, for example, more or less remains polarized around London, also because it's sort of more limited and smaller. Germany has, as you know, a particularly high degree of autonomy. Like the various Länder are just, barely following the monarch. France manages to, if anything, take over, feudal proprietaries' hands, like the other principalities. In southern Italy, you have virtues, especially in Norman Swabian times, like development of central offices that are particularly effective. Among these positions, the justiciary, appointed by the king for a one-year term and endowed with extensive authority in judicial, financial, and military matters together, gained particular significance during Frederick II's early 13th century reforms. The very much needed reforms, especially after the war with the Papists, during the same, at some point intermittently. But, I mean, Frederick's minority had brought to the big degree, again, of public erosions, of privatization, and the Swabian was putting things back together. Also confiscating many rebellious noblemen, of course, lands that were thus sort of made statile in a way. Remember that the reason why the Oathsfield decided to give Constance in marriage to Henry VI was exactly this, that a foreign ruler would be much more interested in maintaining and preserving the centralization of the system than a local rebel nobleman, such as Tancred of Lecce, that, as you know, was defeated and crushed eventually by the same Henry VI during the Succession War. And this is also not to be given for granted as a broader dynamic. These rulers really cared a lot about the statile efficiency of the system. You don't really have a civilization without a state, regardless of what lesser people on Twitter now seem to have, become insanely crazy for, without realizing they're actually sinking in ever greater powerlessness. Now, these Sicilian reforms aimed to reduce the number of counties and form more cohesive regions, as we've seen, reflecting essentially a realistic assessment of the diverse and complex historical and geographical conditions of the 13th and later 15th justiciaries, let's say better, while also striving for greater control over the officials. And again, things were going fairly well up to that point. And so the framework set in the early 13th century, regardless of the later upheavals with the, let's say, the wars of conquest of the Angevins, then again the increasing negotiations with the barons, etc., for ruling over this country, largely maintained its characteristics under later dominations, although interactions became increasingly intricate, that is, messed up during the Angevin period, which began in 1266, due to the monarchy's centralizing tendencies from one side and the escalating demands for autonomy from urban centers, especially from the other. This is crucial, right? When the Angevins arrive, they conquer the land after the crusade against Manfred, the Battle of Benevent, then settling the matter for good with the Battle of Tagliacozzo. I made a video about the latter, the death of Conradin of Swabia. All the pretensions are over, at least like in a dynastic sense. The Sicilian state has lost a great deal of public power. Like, these kings basically have to rule by negotiating with the interland barons that are also the ones that control, as we've seen, the main urban centers as these large sort of agricultural markets for exports. Because again, the economy was doing like pretty big, but the system was gradually eroded in terms of further public culture due to the oligarchization and privatization of the system. Sicily undergoes an important crisis. The Angevins had installed themselves in Naples, and they sort of left Sicily a bit on their own. It's part of the reason why the Vespers succeed. Not quite, but the Aragonese do not do pretty much. Like, Sicily had previously been, again, the most powerful, better organized part. Say in Norman times, in Aragonese times, it sort of falls behind. It's also in part because the crisis of the mid-14th century approaches. This actually helps to consolidate these areas. Like for example, the southern Italian mainland at this point sort of starts going literally on its own, right? There is no chance anymore to feudalize central northern Italy, for example, under some hegemonic force like under the time of Frederick II, Manfred, or Charles of Anjou, right? Sicily provincializes faster. The Aragonese are just like, again, a branch of the House of Aragon. They are pretty much on their own, sometimes even against the same Aragonese proper, and the state there sort of brusquely declines, and sort of, again, it's not like a collapse. Again, this place will keep exporting like crazy. These are very rich areas overall, but again, are ever less regulated. They do seem still, however, like a European average feudal mess, because that's what the normality was at the time. And the Angevins are actually the most powerful part. Like Naples in the 13th, 14th century is really a big thing. And it's so big, in fact, that it's almost impossible to control. In fact, there are some areas like, I don't know, the Abruzzi, that admittedly are poorer, but like there are some also places in Apulia or Calabria that are not really easy to control from Naples. Even if the various members of the Angevin house really are the various fiefs there are so many people from, again, the rest of Europe that we have also seen. The Counts of Dampierre have a fief there. Then you have, at this point, the Tuscans being subcontracted, basically the entire administration and management of the kingdom. So it's a very different system, and the tendency is rather to survive, to cash as much as you can from this system, to milk the cow. Even for the individual, like Angevin government, to really reinforce. For example, at this point there are incredibly expansive, as repeated attempts at reconquering Sicily. The Angevins are the strongest. Again, they invade Sicily over and over again, but they can't fundamentally take it down, right? It becomes an ever more bogged ground, and literally at the thresholds of the mid 14th century crisis, the systems, like basically the entire Eurasian ones, are exhausted. They can't take it anymore. Instead, in the second half of the 15th century, so there's a gradual revival, very different from the great peak of medieval civilization that, say, the Angevins were enjoying when conquering the kingdom. And so we're talking the Aragonese period here. A major because the Aragonese conquered Naples as well later on. There's a major development in the creation of vice royalties, which essentially is what you see, the system remaining up until basically almost the unification of Italy, because technically those were systems depending on Spain, right? And these vice royalties encompassed multiple justiciaries and represented the most extensive unification attempt made by the monarchy in the Mezzogiorno, right? You have, like in the 18th century, by the 18th century, essentially southern Italy is a state on its own. It's not much like a Spanish thing proper, but there are lots of ties. And the sense is that these vice royalties are basically the more comprehensively and straightforwardly unitary polities from which, in fact, the broader state emerges in the south. And again, it goes throughout. In the Renaissance, is a big power. In the Age of Enlightenment, there are these attempted reforms by the Bourbon that, right, in the 18th century are very good monarchs, right? But these reforms fail, and so after also the Napoleonic era, the system does not recover. It becomes increasingly reactionary. It does not invest. It's very backward compared also to the rest of European development at that point. And so, the rest of the story. Now, recent trends in southern Italian historiography suggest that the several cities in the kingdom of Sicily, or let's say in the kingdoms after the Vespers during the later Middle Ages, demonstrate a distinct inclination to organize their territorial regions, right? Whether extensive or economically pivotal. It's part of that tendency to provincialize, as we were saying before, to sort of adapt to the situation, again, having the local barons negotiating this sphere of influence that not even the monarchy can so easily infringe upon. There's sort of many mechanisms that are quite ingenious at some point, like, giving more power to the transhumant shepherd communities of the Apennines to associate as a sort of guilds to oppose the local barons, right, from the side of the crown. We've seen it in a bit about the Aragonese government of Naples. There are all these options at the end of the day. Again, this is not a backward system at all. It's one of the most developed in Europe, feudally wise. It's also one of the biggest. I can't stress this enough. In any case, you have cities evidently gaining, this is typical of the later Middle Ages, like greater importance, right? Cities survive, like are those sort of territorial powers that survive the crisis and tie ever higher in the hierarchy with the monarchy even. In fact, it was sort of easy at that point to, like with an exhausted peasantry that now essentially revolved on the central markets of the cities, to like make the latter sort of the pivot of all the surroundings. And the cities in fact function as residences for royal captains. Like if you tour southern Italy, you can still see all these sort of emblems, insignia. These were, Spanish, French, etc. Aside from the various tombs, the various churches, you see these beautiful men-at-arms. You can see lots of influences. We've seen it in the video about the Sicilian warfare, military culture, let's say. Naturally, the aforementioned cities are having these royal captains associated with the ancient comitatus seat. This is the case even for, like Chieti, for example. just to speak of Abruzzo, just to remain the same province, like you have these commercial hubs such as Lanciano. You have centers that are strategically created, like L'Aquila, in the same area it is today, the center, the capital of the Abruzzi, that takes the name after the eagle, the imperial Catholic eagle, like Frederick II. So you have actually very interesting, very old settlements, very also well organized urban communities. Again, southern Italy is, especially, most people go there for, the sea. Admittedly, it's fantastic. It's probably the best you can find, but like if you actually read about the interland history, like sometimes you can see it in the same cities, in same seasides that date to the Middle Ages. There are some amazing places, but castles with ancient monastic, with all the, say, on top of all the ancient stuff, for example. But like the more rural, the more continental part is overloaded with especially medieval stuff. Also ancient, this is true, but they have lots of modern stuff as well. Again, this is also, especially today, like still, civilized place. But the sense is the enormity of this past, that in part was not represented, as I was saying at the beginning, because these places did not have the level of autonomy to simply describe themselves. Plus, the archives of Naples, I think, were destroyed during World War II by bombardments, and so like it's one of the greatest strategies in the entire history of mankind, and it's difficult even to recollect, thinking how much humanity has lost in this. But it's relevant here, especially, like this is true for both southern Italy and Sicily, right? But passing to the latter, because we have to understand what the islands function like and what were the differences, especially in the later Middle Ages. Again, Naples was the biggest system. The southern Italian mainland was the more statally effective system. In fact, that's also where the Aragonese fundamentally rule from. Also, when they conquered Naples from Sicily, it was sort of more lagging behind. And so when you look at Sicily and Sardinia is even more, on its own. It's a bit of a wilder place, telling the truth. In fact, historically, it has nothing to do with Italy, right? For all the issues with Italian nationality, things, it's like, does Corsica has anything to do with France? No, right? Does Sardinia have anything to do with Italy? No, right? Sardinians, linguistically, ethnically, etc., studied as a separate people. Compared to the Italians, it's really a different thing. Many people stress like Sicily being, to Italy like Texas is to the United States, but it's still Italy, right? It's not, even in the weird and sort of, especially internet culture that somehow develops around all these subcultural mental disturbances, it is still a chunk of actual, ethno-national Italy, historically meant. So you understand that these islands have a millenary history, right? And this does differ forcefully, like all islanders prove, just in many ways, from the continentals, right? Continental Italy is really something else. Again, Sicily is a continuation of mainland Italy in an ethno-linguistical historical sense. Sardinia really isn't. All this shapes foundational lines of territorial organization. In Sicily, for example, the early Islamic settlement resulted, we are in the 9th century, in the division of the island into 3 primary jurisdictions, the so-called valleys that are Demonem, Mazara, and Noto. So think of Sicily like a triangle, and there you have also, like if you cross some internal lines, 3 major valleys that are these ones, that are essentially the provincial basis for ruling the island. That, as you know, has an effectively mountainous interland, and so the grades towards the sea from there, and so these valleys are the main hub of sort of development of administration, of government, and so on. This was true, let's say, already in previous times, right? But let's say, speaking of a reinforced unitary government, when in the 12th century the Norman kings were reinforcing feudalism especially, and focused on the re-Christianization of large areas, this led to the establishment now of new diocesan jurisdictions that were paradoxically often modeled after Islamic districts. Right? It's not, again, these that were not historically based on, say, the Roman ones, but as we observed before, there had been a consistent degeneration of Sicilian administration, also under Byzantine times. Again, very advanced place, very interesting dynamics there of how, for example, how long it took for the Muslims to conquer Sicily as a whole, and how much resistance there was from the Sicilians that were basically left by, let's say, at least the Byzantines did not set their mind in avoiding that conquest, so it was just like a long gradual erosion, so showing that the Saracen power was not that strong to begin with. Now had, speaking again of the Normans, were to restore, if anything, a diocesan administration. As we were saying before, the ecclesiastical administration was crucial, as you know, all across Europe, to reinforce that complementary split of temporal and spiritual power that characterizes Western Christendom in such a successful way. Definitely, during Islamic times, churches had been basically profaned, destroyed. There were some Christian communities taking refuge, for example, in the Sicilian hinterland, that is extremely difficult to sort of enter, to access, also from a strategical point of view. Also, the Normans do not have to fight so harshly like in England to control the place, but they have to be very methodical in besieging town after town, because you can't simply take over everything immediately. And it's not even because the locals are Muslims. It's just because, these are essentially invaders. At times the Normans were even friends with some of the Saracens in Sicily. They had fought for them there. That's also how they were interested in Sicily from the beginning, regardless also the relation with the papacy. Without an ecclesiastical administration, you don't have Western civilization. This is evident in the evangelization of Central, Eastern, Northern Europe. Like everything, civilization exists when an ecclesiastical administration is established next to the secular one. And so the Normans have this unique chance to not just conquer land that had not historically been feudalized, and so with so many noblemen, powerful noblemen entrenched, like in France, in their own prerogatives, but that had not, that at least did not have a previous ecclesiastical administration. It was not really an enormous advantage, because had there been one before, like there would have, of course, this would have normally helped, like the church normally did, the development of the local monarchy. But that would have meant also a secular power that would have been much more resistant. So in England, you see, like, there wasn't feudalism, but there was the church. In Sicily, there's none of them. So literally the Normans can do whatever they want. And so they create their secular and ecclesiastical power how they want. Of course, the Pope intervenes in this. Like, it's not that they can't do literally what they want, but it's all sort of rebuilt almost from scratch, right? In southern Italy, this had not been the case, because all the places were essentially Christian, and so even if there was admittedly a lack of a comprehensive, let's say, in unitary ecclesiastical administration. I mean, there were so many different dioceses, but differently from, for example, the very orderly Italic kingdom, where everybody knew exactly where that commune and that church ended, etc. In southern Italy, it was a complete mess. The boundaries are very blurred. There is no, again, sound, like sort of metropolitic authority that controls like the entire system on behalf also of some other power. It's really that disorderly, and that's also where that aforementioned sort of lack of control that we've seen from probably from the locals came from. Because equally, again, if the church there functions like that, also the secular authority functions in that disorderly way. It's all yet to reform. This is incredibly important to understand. Like this difference, the latter difference in ecclesiastical administration. Had you ever even heard of it? Ever? Like, did you know this was the actual like macroscopic datum about southern Italy compared to the rest of it? It's incredibly important to stress, right? It's not even that they were, again, like normally places where you had to reform the ecclesiastical situation were places that were, poorer, more difficult to connect. Where these were incredibly crowded, stuffed, and very Christian from a very long time, but yet they needed this form of reorganization that only Normans really get. But going back to Sicily, that process of general redrawing of the governmental practice was accompanied by colonization, right? The word lots, as we said before, like French, Germans, Lombards coming with the Normans and being settled here and there in very strategic ways. This brought, with such a sort of generally controlled dynamic, to the consolidation of land and urban areas under a direct statal control. Right, this was the extreme advantage that the Normans had, especially in Sicily. It was the softest of all these territories. This allowed, for example, to address the ongoing issues of the casali, that were these essentially open villages. Casale is still a term for these farms in Italy. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen played an active role in settlement policies, founding and strengthening various centers while establishing magistracies with extensive jurisdictional and fiscal authority. We're talking about the justiciaries, the secreti, right, over large regions in individual centers, the baiuli, the bailiffs, basically. In the Aragonese times, starting in the late 13th century, remember we're talking Sicily here, we're after the Vesper, 1282, royal institutions remained largely unchanged, although the presence of lordly domains, often linked to prominent Catalan lineages, grew stronger, right? This is a very evident dynamic. Like these Aragonese were largely projected through, of course, Catalan sea power. Recently also made a video about the Catalan company that was born actually in Sicily during the Wars of the Vespers and then left for the east. And so even in this case you have lots of adventurers, a lot of again, the Vespers were a coup, basically, and so there isn't a major conquest, some full settlement. Again, there are wars going on, and the Angevins are always about to throw back to the sea the Catalans from Sicily. But this system holds, but again, it's impoverished, it's sort of shattered by the invasions. State lands and urban centers maintained in Sicily their significance and privileges, especially because of this further oligarchization and privatization of the baronial side. So it's interesting because you have these families marrying to, again, this foreign nobility, like local Sicilians with the Catalans, similar things, just to maintain the power that you can see again in this ideal sense of the great Sicilian landlord. And you have famous movies, The Leopard, with Burt Lancaster playing one of these, in fact, Sicilian latifundium owners, like after the famous novel by Tommasi di Lampedusa. So as for Sicily too, like there is this relationship between Sicilian cities and the crown, right? And something very similar to what happens, for example, in France, right, between the so-called Bonne Ville du Roi, in fact, the French monarch. There is a gradual reliance. This is true also in Naples, but in Sicily it's more pronounced, of the monarchy on the cities, right? In part, this happens because Sicily is smaller, so it's somewhat as a system, right? It's actually pretty big, but you see, it has this more straightforward political and territorial control and distribution and control. Let's say Naples is much more composite. So in Sicily, there is an attempt to make the city like the cornerstone. Also, again, the dynamic is the same. The barons control the city as a large agricultural market, and they have this interland power. But they're easier, like, to be all Sicilians, right? Where there isn't like a chunk of different regions, like in southern Italy, where you have Calabria from one side, Apulia, Campania, the Abruzzi, etc., like Lucania. This is different, right? This is much less. You see that the Neapolitan hinterland is even much more feudal to a degree, right? It has more resources to be so. There are some counties that will evolve to be particularly powerful, right? There are various provinces that are much more numerous than just Sicilian tripartition, right? So it's much easier to conceive this system unitarily. This, however, does not mean that controlling the island in terms of political negotiation was that easier or remunerative, right? If anything, the contrary. Overall, by the end of the Middle Ages, the territorial regulations of the Sicilian kingdom are characterized by a triangular interaction among the monarchy, the aristocracies, and the cities. That actually is, again, also in this case, very similar to the rest of Europe, Western Europe, and will stay more or less that way. Finally, Sardinia, right? So first of all, in later times, we have this idea that the island interland was ruled by 4 judicates that were some sort of counties, basically, dating to the Byzantine era in terms of general mindset, with this sort of Romance legacy. Sardinia was a very sort of introverted land, let's put it in this way, because the coasts were ravaged, but the interland was wild. Many areas, like you have this very tough, sort of brutal, sort of mountaineer shepherd populations, but there is also a level of civilization to a degree that maintains, because of the general wealth distribution, like an important level of literacy, an important level of general governmental functioning, but it shouldn't be overrated, right? In fact, we mythologized a bit this island in that sort of uniqueness. There weren't those 4 judicates that sort of would correspond to particular parts of the Sardinian hinterland, also from an administrative point of view today, right? The real territorial administration was subdivided into smaller jurisdictions. The curatoria, led by a curator, appointed by the judge, right? This greater figure that should have been, in fact, at the head of these other territorial entities. And lower, you had the villages. And so basically this was a system that recognized itself internally on the basis of the judicates and this lower hierarchy of communities, and that had some negotiation capacity with at least the much more predatorily powerful foreigners that came to occupy the island coastline, right? Such as the peasants, for example, that are incredibly successful. There are still some peasant towers in Sardinia. Mostly the peasants would just control the ports, so that from the valleys, like precious metals, any export would be controlled by them. The peasants had overwhelming naval superiority. They came there as knights, right? Saying the same judges could say, "Do you want to be the lord of this place on our behalf?" Yes, and they cooperated. They shared power. It was a very adventurous. It was a sort of Sardinian El Dorado, even though it was mostly silver that they extracted from there. And Pisa made an enormous lot of money, right? Until the beginning of the 14th century with the Battle of Lucca Cisterna, where the peasants and the Germans are defeated by the Aragonese, the Catalans, that become the main controllers of the island, especially in the south, because they take Cagliari, that is it's the major city in the south, at the end of this major and really only fertile area, that is the Campidano Plain. The Genoese infest the north because they have Corsica, and from there, and their significant naval power and general hostility towards the Catalans, they harassed the Spanish in Sardinia. And technically they could have ousted them, but they never concentrated themselves into this enterprise particularly. And we'll have to come back on Genoese history, because that's also one of the other sort of very overlooked ones to tell, especially in relation to these major Tyrrhenian islands. And so even when we look at the Judicates and this Pisan infiltration, was very almost a form of colonization. Like the peasants again had the upper hand, were the more sort of straightforwardly Romano-Frankish, Latin Germanic force that was coming to civilize a bit, like, I don't know, the English with the Irish, just to make a brutal comparison. The Sardinians were a bit more civilized than the Irish, but barely so. And the truth, in fact, it was no such thing like the establishment of a lordly framework across the island. I mean, even the various judicates that recognized one another did not really have a central institution that would simply delegate power. Like the feudal system would not prevail. This is really the characteristic of Sardinia, and that's why it's so unique, because it's a sort of, again, elaboration of the late antique, Roman juridical tradition to an extent, but in Sardinian source. And there is really nothing in the hinterland, not to be brutal about this, but again, Sardinia is a pretty wild place, right? Sometimes in the hinterland it has pretty big mountains, it has pretty desolated places, just brutal shepherds that spend their lives cutting each other's throat, stealing sheep, right? And they would make sort of great soldiers throughout all history. For this reason, we were talking about it yesterday in the video about the Tercio of Sardinia. Look at what the Sardinians did on the admiral ship at Lepanto. We have seen the Sassari Brigade also in a recent video about World War I, because these were really tough people, like very, very, especially during World War I, they were a pluridecorated unit. But as other brutally tough people, like, it's not because they developed a civilization out of that, quite the opposite. And so you have this more advanced lords on the outside, and this hinterland of just people that were looking sinisterly at them from a place that nobody really wanted to conquer. Again, imagine the Vikings and Ireland, the English and Ireland. It's almost pretty much like the same thing. So there were castles, of course, which served primarily as fortifications rather than centers of authority. There was a significant demographic and social transformation throughout the 13th century. This essentially fostered urban development. This brought to the influence of continental noble families, as we've seen, to gradually alter the judicial structure of the island, which had remained quite peculiar and isolated. Technically, this had been part of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, but gradually, even though we know that there were, Sardinian bishops that attended in the early Middle Ages councils in Constantinople, even in times where the Saracens were all around, this is We know that there were even Christians from Islamic Sicily that attended these county councils. It's really impressive, really, monks, etc. So this to tell you how layered the reality really was. But they had remained somehow severed without any major connections with the outer side, and again, mostly sheltering against these invasions. You have something similar to what we've seen in southern Italy, except they're a bit of a tougher nut to crack in their sort of wilderness and in general brutality. This pattern of urbanization and feudalization does not, however, alter, in fact, certain parts of the hinterland. It's very varied across different parts of the island. As we were saying at the beginning, Sardinia becomes a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, right? This is extremely important. Also, Corsica really was, because it had been part of the Longobard kingdom and was also controlled by Genoa. This kingdom is just a creation of Frederick II for his son to give him an important feudal title. It definitely does mirror the influence, the power that the Southern Italian monarchy has, because Frederick II does this fundamentally. Yes, he's a Holy Roman Emperor, but he rules from Sicily. So the notion here is that Sardinia is lorded over, as we will see better in more in-depth videos, by the same Sicilian power to the Swabian one. Namely, though, because again, nobody really controls this place, and it remains really peripheral to various struggles. In fact, it's not even so crucial. The only ones that really remain there throughout all this period are the peasants until the Aragonese arrive. The Aragonese really strip Sardinia, the peasants of Sardinia, interestingly enough, with the support of the Pope, that at that point, even though Aragon was a Ghibelline power, was allied with them. He wanted to harass the Angevins. This is, again, we will see it in where this wanted to punish the Angevins for not having been particularly stimulating, not particularly, say, active, because they were fixating with Sicily and not looking at much else. But it's a very complicated story. Also, the Aragonese of Sardinia do not really bond very much with the rest of the Aragonese crown. They remain large, mostly maritime bases for Catalan trade, and occasional incursions, say, on southern Italy to harass the Angevins, etc. But they're different chunks, and you basically control just the coastline, right? And not even all of it. Again, the north witnesses the Genoese, but after all, it's just the south, Cagliari, that you want to control. This is interesting because you would imagine, now I conquer an entire island, I will be stronger. No, not really. If you have to spend too much to control everything, and you just control the best fortified area in the south, that takes pretty massive expedition from the enemy to strip you of it. You can just control those places, and who cares, right? It's always risky. It's not like it can't happen, but all these powers are always floating into an unpredictable condition all the time. So they had also other priorities. And so, again, not much changes juridically, also with the Aragonese in 1324. But this conquest still marks a critical turning point in low medieval Sardinia, which is also a terrible place. There is an epidemic, there's malaria, there is, again, the hinterland is very, very wild and brutal and primitive to an beyond hyperbolic statement. Now, if anything, what changes are the broader forms of territorial organization. For example, the aforementioned curatoria disappeared. This is interesting because it shows that as middle-aged, say, actors had not really ever counted too much. But remember, this happens also during the mid-14th century crisis, so these lower systems were basically the bottom Like, yes, there are the villages, but the villages literally do not count much to begin with in a broader political sense. So you just have what before were the Judicates, now having become feudal lordships, right? There is only the famous Judicate of Arborea, which stands its ground, right? And this polity is very interesting. We'll have to talk about it sometimes. It's a very good idea actually for a regional history chapter. But it's a history intertwined with the House of Aragon, with international marriages. At this point, it's mostly a history of international elite rather than sort of clamorous local developments. Naturally, also the Sardinians have gradually civilized, feudalized, you can say westernized to the extent, again, this is all a broader Frankish system by approximation that has taken over Europe. And so I hope that this gives you a somehow sketchy but sound understanding of what these areas really were. Right, this tells you also how, in spite of all the differences, there's a common thread in all these diverse experiences of continental southern Italy and the two major Mediterranean islands. That is the impact of royal power on territorial organization. If you really want to see that, it's civilization in form of state that really achieves an important objective, right? There are, as we were saying at the beginning, some fringe areas of Europe that will remain fringe because they are fringe. They're very poor and backward. In southern Italy, in spite of the pre-existing lack of a unifying power, and these kingdoms at the end of the Middle Ages are actually three. You have Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples. There are three different things. Even when the Aragonese conquer Naples, they maintain two distinct vice kingdoms. They are, however, very much brought within probably a Western system. Like, you can't look at these places and say, okay, yes, they could be backwards in by 18th century societal development and compared to the most updated northwestern countries. Yes, that's true. But by medieval standards, they have a very solid development, institutionally speaking, and especially southern Italy from the Norman times is really very well administered. I mean, southern Italy and Sicily. Sardinia is basically the same, except it's a bit poorer in the hinterland. That's basically it. And so when you look at all these various political and social reasons, you realize that the monarchy faced challenges in developing new and more advanced forms of sovereignty, like leading to complexities in territorial configurations during the modern age, right? Especially that excellency reached by the we talked about this in the videos about the history of law, right? The Melfi constitutions, the Ariano constitutions, those really marked the peak of centralization in Western Europe, far more ahead than any other state in the Latin Germanic West. And yet they erode, right? They don't go to beyond, right? It's the peak that basically any sovereign is able to assert. It does not go more far than the king has the right essentially to make new laws if some do not work or if there is a gap, right? So it's not like he technically can simply legislate on top of nothing. But this is basically, from a legal point of view, the top level of centralization and royal power that will occur until Napoleon, right? In a strictly juridical sense. Consider that, for example, southern Italy maintains a very complex juridical tradition. These lands have some sort of common law of their own that, in the case of the southern Italian mainland, is Lombard law, right, that will remain actually until the 19th century into the actual southern Italian juridical system, which is, if you think about it, it's really fascinating, because as you know, the rest of Italy and from there the rest of Europe, like, had, at least the most advanced parts of Europe, had adopted Roman law. So again, made lots of videos about how things evolved in all of Europe. Now, I will not digress on strictly juridical issues, but you understand that especially this bigger, more promising system somehow does not hold, right? Does not hold because perhaps of the exposure of this land, at least being so rich and sort of at the end of the day relatively isolated. I mean, if you look at the battles of Benevent or Tagliacozzo, you realize that there were chances to simply retake this kingdom. There were chances later, aside from the Aragonese that literally did so from the sea, because they were also that close with Sicily. But the history of southern Italy was decided on multiple occasions by single battles, right? Depending who would rule there, right, was a matter of these major clashes were actually the largest battles in medieval Europe. Right? Benevent, Tagliacozzo are, together with Markfeld, I think, the largest battles of medieval knights, right, in numerical terms, of the heavily armored horsemen, like in history. And so you really want to take a look at them. I made a video about the Battle of Tagliacozzo that is naturally very, very touching, especially because of the fate of poor Conradin, the tragic epopee of the Hohenstaufen. What you may want to appreciate beyond this alternation of rulers is in fact how the system worked and what kind of identity it really had. And I am not really an expert on this, let's say on this topic specifically, but my impression also with other European countries is that there is always a much more straightforwardly unitary background to most of these sort of regional realities. And so that in spite of what we see again with this historiographical bombardment of look at here how many different ethnicities and cultures and religions. Actually, southern Italy, I think, had a pretty, similar backbone at the end of the day, right? What had come to happen in its historical, say, political making, let's put it in this way, is to be attributed to the, say, if anything, the difficulties of these foreign rulers in negotiating power locally rather than actually this land's not having really an identity on its own. And it's obvious that there are other countries in Europe, let's say other parts of Europe, where you can draw parallelisms that, however, are different. For now I'm thinking, for example, about Occitania. Right, Occitania was at some point simply taken over by the French monarchy and always remained under the French monarchy. At the same time, actually, the same kingdom of Naples under the French Angevins was a kingdom on its own. It was not even properly technically part of France, and with on its own identity and power and local traditions and national identity, unlike Occitania, where that was sort of wiped out, right? In southern Italy, as we said at the beginning, you can't even technically say that these are a different ethnicity, a different people. They have a different language. They're basically Italian. And so, actually, there doesn't seem there to be a particular difference even in the way, for example, this system simply detached from the rest of central northern Italy, if not in a strictly political sense, meaning that actually this land was in between major powers, like again the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantines, you had the papacy next. So if anything, this land was torn apart mainly by the fact that it was located in a space contended by different powers more than else. Like, it wasn't really the product of a different national ethnogenesis, right? I can think of Andalusia in southern Spain, but Andalusia as well, like, was eventually run by Castile, and it entered to be part of that system also relatively early. Instead, southern Italy was, for example, we depicted now southern Italy as if, they were broken, they didn't have any autonomy, but again, behind these monarchies, there was an autonomy of theirs, right? Countries like Occitania or Andalusia, for example, are instead really broken. Like, they don't have a continuity in local institutions or whatever. They can, but they're fundamentally reformed entirely by the new conquerors. Like, there had been 700 years of Islamic domination, and yet you have, of course, like a much deeper distance, right, from that. In southern Italy, you can't say that. These are Christian lands. Even the Islamic domination of Sicily does not really last that long. And they're especially lands that are always deeply connected to the major Western powers, right? Even the Byzantines are, in this sense, sort of acting in Italy as still, yes, they are foreigners, they are different in many ways, but they are part of a shared unitary past that, especially in southern Italy, found great points of contact. So it's a civilized land. It's not a, some sort of failed pre-civilization. You may actually argue that there is something to it, that southern Italy, again, was never dominated by any, unitarily, by any let's say, European, or at least even just nationally enucleated people. It's a fundamentally Italian territory that remains ruled either by the locals or by peoples that would exact of Islamic Sicily, and even in the Byzantine case, but with a lot of previous, sense that it was part of the, Roman background. And in fact, decentralizes a lot. I talked a lot about sort of the equation of Byzantine to Longobarд Italy at so many levels, compared probably to the core of Byzantine power, that always remain ruled also later by Western systems that do not ever, for example, treat these places as, you can see, like with conquered areas, like, I don't know, we mentioned before England with Ireland, right? It's not even the case for Sardinia, technically. So more often than not, like, whoever ruled in southern Italy was often even not as really excessively or at all more developed than southern Italy itself. So it's a very different scenario. It's really an exceptional one. And as we've seen also in the recent video about 14th century Hungary, it's from here that, say, the Angevins send, their own offspring to rule over Hungary and Poland. So it's actually, especially under the Angevins, such a great center of power. If we're not talking about the Normans or the Swabians, think about the Sicilian school of poetry. It's one of, like, Palermo is the center of the world in those years, right? The Stupor Mundi and beyond. So it influences the Dolce Stil Novo, Dante, the Tuscan school of poetry. Like, again, it's such an evidently unique land that it really makes you think, as we're just saying, that there is something very much likely more unitary behind the system than we think. It's probably a mistake to think that they would have themselves sort of thought politically or communitarily in that way. But here we're looking at the essence of their general output, right? It's obvious that in those times you would mostly live into your own city. We've seen how sort of introverted these southern Italian cities were before, at least depending on who they were, like mostly the ones of the hinterland, I mean, before the Norman conquest, because otherwise some were very active, very entrepreneurial. I mean, Bari, Amalfi were some early maritime republics, so they didn't even lack that capacity to put themselves out there and expand. Hadn't there been a feudal power that eventually curbed their their capacity. So you don't even see, in spite of later issues historically, say these, like for example in continental southern Italy, I don't know, different chunks acting as if they were not part of the kingdom. Yes, it is true. Some parts were very autonomous. Also in the early modern age, they sort of behaved. But isn't this like normal, like by feudal Western standards to a degree? I mean, I don't know. Also, the Bourbon had a state within France that at some point also began to fight against it. So we should be careful to when, in particular, like posing southern Italy also always as this paradigm of inefficiency and shortcoming and backwardness, because basically, except in the last couple of hundred years, it technically was, and even when things went badly at a time, it was still, I mean, compared to what they could achieve or they had achieved at some point, they were still normally more advanced than most of Europe, and most even of Western Europe especially during the Middle Ages. So the question is, again, probably we need to look at this much more thoroughly and to accept that history is not about dichotomies. It's not about deterministic systems. It's very complex, and if anything, it's the historiographical narrative that sort of, however complicated things beyond, especially in terms of perception and subjective judgment, what probably was very different on its own. Like I'm making very here sort of sophisticated and bold and daring statements, but really not. I'm really being very straightforward and like pursuing my idea of objective history, of course. Otherwise I wouldn't even have a YouTube channel to begin with, but the sense being also that there is a particularly large amount of unexplored European history that the same Europeans, the same Westerners do not adequately know, and for no good valid reason. And my point with Schwerpunkt is always to bring this on the fore, to confront people with their own limits, to challenge them in being more critical, more knowledgeable, especially, and really say getting to the point that there is always much more to know that you didn't even have the playlist idea that it was, right? So I don't know how many people will watch this video, because I don't know, sometimes YouTube is really weird, and I think especially Southern Italian stuff is not watched that much, if I'm not wrong, but it's such an important page in history. I hope, at least to myself, to make more videos on this topic. How many? I always do this to lengthen a bit the video, to comment, to think, to feel more accomplished about having made a certain amount of content. It's because I don't remember all. I mean, I remember all the videos I made when I see them, but it's not like I remember by heart how much there was, and it's normally, in fact, always more than I thought. So let's say Southern Italy. Here I separated Southern Italy and Sicily, which is, I don't know, how do I frame this video now? Playlist. Is there a playlist? Yeah, there should be a playlist, but wow, isn't there? Really? You're kidding me. How is it possible? I surely have a Southern Italian. Oh, okay, medieval Southern. I had mistyped. Schwerpunkt. I was written. 17 videos. Well, actually, it's not that much. Because I didn't include Sicily in it. Yep. Yeah, I remember at the beginning when I made this distinction. It's not a very watched playlist. People do not watch very much this type of sort of. Well, this shouldn't really be into Southern Italy, should it be? Yeah, well, 17 for medieval southern Italy, and I think something more for Sicily. Well, probably inserted in both playlists then at a time. Yeah, already done this. Yeah. 28 videos about Sicily, really? Compared to southern Italy. Well, it doesn't even make much sense, actually, because... Oh, well, yeah, because I made a series about that, yeah. And I inserted also a Kingdom of Sicily. I don't like this organization. It should create something more comprehensive for medieval southern Italy and Sicily altogether, because it's also easy to make. And this can be big. And in fact, here this has more views. Well, yeah, predictably. But we must make more, much more. Because again, we haven't really cared too much about this southern Italy. It's really. I'm glad recently I made videos on it, but we must do more, right? And surely there will be the chance. For now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me and wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.